Thanks, Sakshi, Steve, Jaspreet, and with that, we come to the final session here at the Enterprise Innovation Summit 2021. Now, EIS 2021 is the hashtag where all the conversation is alive out there on social media, and you could join the chat online. We've got giveaways by the hour for you to back, and of course, you could also do that while you listen to our cybersecurity masterclass, quantifying business and cyber risks for better resilience in the new world. Now, this discussion features Jim Fitzsimmons, the principal for APAC at Control Risks, and his work has focused on the business impact of cybersecurity risk. And he's joined by Hemant Shivakumar, the associate director at Control Risks, and he focuses on analysis of political, economic, and regulatory developments in the South Asia region. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ashwin. Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Fitzsimmons. I'm with Control Risks. And today, my colleague and I would like to talk to you a little bit about how technology and information handling regulation is beginning to affect business operations all around the region. Next slide. Hemant, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, Jim. Hi, everyone. My name is Hemant Shivakumar. I look after control risks, political and regulatory risk practice across India and South Asia. I've spent about 10 years in the region. And today, along with Jim, I'm going to be talking about technology regulations in India, specifically focusing on the data privacy bill as well as the broader cybersecurity framework. We'll chat a little bit about the developments and outlook surrounding these imminent legislations.
Thank you, Hemant. And as I said, my name is Jim Fitzsimmons, and I lead Control Risk Cybersecurity practice in Asia Pacific. I have perhaps too much experience doing cybersecurity work. I've been doing it for over 20 years now. And what I've been doing recently in the region is really looking at some of these issues in places like China and Southeast Asia. And really what our goal today is to bring some of these issues in some of the frameworks and approaches we develop to help us look and examine what the potential impact of the new regulations in India will be. Hemant, next slide, please. So let's begin. What we call this is digital sovereignty. Digital sovereignty is the state, the government, the regulator, taking power and taking back power over how technology and information is used in society. Now, I'm an American, and the commercialization of the internet really began in the United States, and it began with very, very little regulation. In fact, effectively none, very deliberately so. And that commercialization of that technology has grown and flourished in a way that's really changed our societies and changed how we do business. But as governments have begun to look more closely at this, they're understanding the cybersecurity risks that these kinds of technology brings. And so governments, like they would anywhere, are responding to this with the tools that they are most familiar with, which are new regulations. So when we talk about digital sovereignty, it really is the state reasserting its control over what happens within its borders. And so that digital sovereignty, the risks that introduced to a company, it could affect the opportunities that company has in a marketplace. It could affect how a company operates and how it works. And also it could introduce significant compliance requirements to that organization. When we go to the next slide, please, Emma. We've been looking at this for quite a while. Last 3, 4, 5 years, as these regulations have really begun to grow and to develop. The first impact that our clients have really seen has been strategic. In some cases, an example could be internet services in China. By virtue of the regulations, their business model may not be possible in a country like that. So that's a very big strategic impact of digital sovereignty regulations. At a more straightforward level, there could be an impact around how a company manages itself. And so I live in Singapore, and we have the Personal Data Privacy Act here that mandates that organizations have a data privacy officer. That's a very simple example, but it could be things that touch on incident management, crisis management, technology operations, all these kinds of requirements that really change how an organization works. Lastly, in very much a straightforward way, and I think in a way that many organizations can have an immediate understanding of, is around compliance. And those are the requirements that are set out very specifically in the regulations that organizations now must make sure that they can provide an attestation and evidence that they comply by these laws and they comply by these regulations. This is something that in a very, very simple way, is where a lot of the cost comes from. And that's where we see a lot of our clients beginning to have challenges as they have a global operation or even a nationwide operation, but they're suddenly being subjected to localized requirements. So, Hemant, the next slide, please. Let me talk a little bit about really where our perspective is developing from and what our experience has been. So really, if you look at the Asia Pacific region, these kinds of regulations develop very, very quickly here. And part of that's because the internet and internet technology took off in a way here that nowhere else in the world is seen. The use of mobility, mobile phones, and internet technology, and the combination of those have really changed how the technology, not how it necessarily works, but how it's delivered and how it's central it's become to so many people's lives. In countries like China and India, with their massive populations, mean that that kind of technology reaches a critical mass, which has mass that has an impact that many, many other countries don't see for a long time. So in the Asia Pacific region, since about 2017, we've been working with our colleagues in China and understanding the China cybersecurity law, which is really probably the most forward-looking and one of the most comprehensive regulations that we've ever seen for this kind of these kinds of requirements for companies. But that's not the only country that does this. We also see it in Australia with personal information, cybersecurity, and now also with critical infrastructure. And then recently we've done a project working and looking at how these regulations are developing in ASEAN states like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, and soon Indonesia. It's a dynamic region of the world which has large populations, which has access to technology, access to mobility, and that's changing some of the ways these societies operate. And so like those changes they've also brought concerns and risks. And so now we've seen the government is really starting to change their approach to it. And they're introducing new regulations to manage how information is handled, how it's processed, who can have it, what they can do with it, but also the kinds of technology controls to protect it and secure it, both from attackers inside the country or cyber criminals or things like that, but also, and more critically, attackers outside the country, because national security, as we'll discuss, is a key concern. Hemant, next slide, please.
Sure. Jim, if I can just quickly pop on a question
Sure.
before I move on to the next slide. So you did mention China as the regional leader. Could you kind of like explain from what perspective are you looking at that?
Well, so it's a good question, and don't think of it that it's just that they're better or worse than the other country. It's just that they have a very unique political culture. And so historically, the Chinese state has always wanted to control the media. For them, the internet is another medium. So there's very famous things like the Great Firewall. And in many ways, the Chinese internet is isolated from the rest of the world to a certain extent. But what they've done there is they've put out the most comprehensive set of regulations that covers not only personal information, but also information that may be considered important to the state, as well as a quite comprehensive risk-based cybersecurity control set. So something unique and different, but what we would say is that it won't be unique and different for all, because we see all sorts of other countries all around the world, and not all states like the Chinese state, but democracies and indeed monarchies, who are all adopting these kinds of regulations as we're all trying to adapt and manage the risks that are uncovered.
And do you see similar motivations driving regulations in ASEAN countries?
Indeed, it's really that aspect of national security, which I touched on earlier, is something that for all these countries becomes an overriding concern. If you think about it, the personal information of your citizens, of your soldiers, of your regulators, of your government, of your media, all these things are resources for an attacker. And so when you see these thefts, these large-scale thefts of personal data, that information is being used and reused for phishing attacks or disinformation and misinformation campaigns. We see this as one of the sort of practical realities of looking in the future, where you have these massive social media networks that messages echo through at a speed unheard of in the past. And now you look at the governments who see that, It makes them very uncomfortable because they feel that their state, their country, may be subject to influences that are outside that may not be aligned with their interests.
That's interesting. And if I may just ask one final question for this particular line of thought, which is what lessons are there for India in this case?
So, these regulations are going to change how India does business. And I think that what's going to be, the biggest challenge is how complex it is to enforce them. And what's going to happen to the different kinds of, so India as a place that produces technology and nurtures technology and wants to develop national champions in technology. How can these regulations help that? But also the concern is how could they impede it? And more broadly, trying to understand how these regulations could impact how society interacts both with itself, but also with the government. And understanding how that balance works is a challenge for any democratic state.
Yeah, makes sense. Let me just...
So maybe, Hemant, if you could just talk us through the PDP, take a look at that.
Sure, Jim, thanks. The regional outlook, as you've correctly pointed out, quite a number of dynamics happening across the Asia-Pacific region. And the story is not very different in India. Just by reasons of background, the broader digital sovereignty landscape within India, the early debate started around when the Aadhaar was, India's unique biometric ID system was being implemented. It started in 2009 and then slowly expanded by 2014 to cover a whole host of public services. And then Prime Minister Narendra Modi, when he came to power in 2014, he also launched the Jan Dhan bank accounts for all, basically providing bank accounts for almost the entire population. But the next significant step that happened within India's digital landscape was the 2017 Supreme Court ruling on right to privacy, following which the federal government then subsequently set up a committee to look into some of the broader global debates, but to equally come up with some recommendations around how India could go ahead and draft a data privacy bill, which is where the debate is right now. The data privacy bill is very much, as many members in the informed audience would know, is very much in the parliament and is being discussed as well. But it's interesting to step back for a second and look at how the government's relationship with data itself has been evolving over the last decade. And some of these timelines actually point to that aspect. But equally important are some of the key themes that are playing out more prominently across India's digital sovereignty debates. We've captured 3 of them based on a reading of the landscape. And this is an evolving framework, very much to say, but the three key pillars that stand out for present are one is national security that drives data. That's driving policy as far as the digital sovereignty landscape is concerned. And then you have a broader opportunity argument where you are seeing the emergence of newer domestic champions, newer domestic businesses that are operating within this data landscape. And finally, a mix of some of these factors are also triggering increased and uneven regulation. And quickly to unpack some of these is in terms of national security, if you look at it first, largely driven by government's recognition of data as a strategic asset. So what this essentially means is policymakers want to maintain discretion into how they decide around data policies. And there's a very strong, as we pointed out, Jim, a very strong sovereignty element associated with how India handles data. And this is not unique to India. This is something that's playing out in other countries as well. But interestingly, what we are also seeing is a parallel debate along a cybersecurity strategy. Let's not forget 2013 is when India's cybersecurity policy was released. And now the federal government is talking about releasing a cybersecurity strategy in 2021. And as far as the broader opportunity argument is concerned, you're seeing a far more vibrant data-built ecosystem that's emerging from a very commercial perspective, which was not present in the earlier part of the decade. And now all of a sudden you have a lot of companies, both domestic and foreign, that are trying to operate within this data ecosystem. e-commerce, for example, is one of them. You've had 100% foreign direct investment opened up into e-commerce companies. But that's also led to a broader innovation among like domestic firms as well, which are fast competing with some of these foreign-based e-commerce companies as well. So along that, you also have like cloud service providers, you have like data center operators, all of who are domestic based and who are also equally driving some of these debates around data and data sovereignty as well. But equally, what we've been seeing as far as the regulatory bits are concerned is some of the geopolitical elements taking a more firm shape and playing through these three key pillars: national security, be it the business ecosystem, as well as the broader regulatory framework. Case in point is again the tensions between India and China in 2020, which led the federal government to ban several Chinese apps, and some of these very prominent tensions will continue to determine how policy also plays out. But equally, regulation, what we're seeing so far is regulation continues to, at least the debates around it and enforcement continues to be a little bit uneven. There are the discussions around personal and non-personal data, which will continue to drive a lot of these regulatory enforcement is still ongoing. But equally, jurisdictions, given that India has a federal state structure, cybersecurity and data related jurisdictions between states as well as the federal government, and how that plays out is also something that will play out more prominently in the coming months and years.
Maybe I can just ask a couple of follow-up questions.
Yeah.
First, to talk a little bit about specific technologies and how these kinds of regulations in India could potentially affect that. So the one technology I think that everyone's familiar with, even just by its acronym, is artificial intelligence, machine learning, AI/ML. Do you see any impact around a technology like that, and how the regulations could impact how either companies could adopt it, or how it could be developed, or its development in India?
It's an interesting question, Jim. I mean, these are early stages, obviously, and something that given that some of these debates are still playing out. It's not clear as to how the government might approach governing the artificial intelligence and the machine learning space. But interestingly, what we are seeing so far, like even if I were to pick the data privacy bill as an example, you do have an element of a sandbox related regulation that's being introduced into the data privacy bill itself. So there is a certain kind of accommodation from the part of the government to understand that there are newer technologies that might have to be accommodated. But equally, what could also happen is sometimes regulators might wear a compliance lens and look at some of these emerging technologies from a purely compliance perspective. So that can also drive compliance risk. So that's also something to factor in, despite it being an early stage technology, and something that still is driving the debate around the broader digital sovereignty landscape.
That's interesting. And, because in China, they have only just started to begin to regulate AI/ML. And one of the things that they're concerned about is how AI/ML can be used to process personal data. And I think the specific example in China's new privacy regulation sets a process whereby, like, you can't I think, how is it phrased, but you can't provide this two different people, two different prices for something based on their profile, which is an interesting aspect. It's a very, very common aspect, I think, in e-commerce, but in China, they're starting to regulate that. And maybe that kind of segues a little bit into I think an interesting follow-up question, really more so around the national security side. We talked about the Chinese apps that were banned recently. We know that we've talked to people around, Chinese cloud service providers not being very common or popular, or really having a chance to break into the India market. If you look at these issues around national security, how do you see sort of that dynamic between China and India maybe affecting the opportunities for Chinese companies to work in India, to gain market share in India? Do you think there's an opportunity for them, or do you think that perhaps not?
I think the answer to that is there would be a middle ground. I mean, and to a large extent, it would also be linked to geopolitical sensitivities that continue to play out along the borders as well. So what came out in fact in terms of India's regulatory enforcement last year was largely linked to some of these tensions that were playing out in the border as well, and therefore increased scrutiny on Chinese companies or banning of Chinese apps as well. But again, I think it's what we also have to bear in mind is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and government will be far more. I mean, the government is likely to be far more measured into trying and seeing how the economics of some of these play out as well. But again, geopolitics will be an increasingly determining factor into the data privacy and the broader data ecosystem as well. And that's something companies will, I mean, both domestic as well as international businesses will have to factor in. You could possibly have like export or import controls, or you could have like additional compliance requirements that come on the back of some of these tensions. And therefore that's not something that you can wish away with. And therefore, to try and understand where your servers are located, trying and locating your servers within India, and some of these regulatory dynamics will need to be factored in by information and cybersecurity governance officers.
It's a really good point, because we've also seen that with China and the US in supply chain risk around technology and information. So, but please, if you continue on to your next slide, I think you talk a little bit more about some of the implications for the firms.
Yeah, Jim, thanks. I mean, we've already touched a little bit upon this as far as the relationship with China reflected in policy and practice. But again, I think it's broadly applies to other countries and how India or other countries also navigate. So what are some of the regional developments? You've mentioned quite a number of regulatory dynamics across ASEAN playing out as well. So these will continue to feed into India's evolving data regulatory frameworks, and then again determine how Indian businesses will react, or how global businesses might also act within Indian borders as well. But as far as the national security angle is concerned, there's an additional angle that needs to be borne out, which is around the evolving cybersecurity framework. So India is due to release, or it has announced it's due to release a national cybersecurity strategy by the end of this year. And it comes also at an interesting time, because it's expected to provide a broad guideline as to how India would regulate the cybersecurity space. But I think the interesting aspect for businesses would be to look at like what are some of the overlaps as far as the data privacy discussions are concerned. What are some of the stakeholders who are being like engaged in some of these debates cutting across? Is there broader convergence between both of these bills, or both of these debates, or are there more points of contradiction? Because all of that will again like feed into how companies plan for their cybersecurity governance as well as information governance as well. On the national security bit, again, the other interesting angle that I think it's worth bearing in mind for businesses is developments around critical infrastructure. I mean, you obviously have the traditional critical infrastructure elements like telecommunications, banks, utilities, energy. All of that goes into that basket. But let's not forget the number of digital transactions, the UPI payments that India is registering on a monthly basis is over 2 billion or 3 billion. And that's the volume of transaction that's being recorded. And it's the digital payments ecosystem is becoming more and more critical. So you might have some of these newer infrastructures that are coming up now being kind of being seen as more strategic, as well as like being seen as more critical as well. Which brings me to my next broader point about like how might regulatory policy making along these, like, because you've got these different strands of thought that are playing out in the Indian scenario itself. What kind of policy making might it lead to? Would it be ad hoc? Would it be more coherent? I think the answer is somewhere both. But for foreign companies as well as like domestic companies, I think the point to take away is in terms of compliance costs. What we're seeing as far as some of these very early dynamics are concerned is that there is likely to be higher compliance for foreign companies. You're looking at like data localization requirements around like data processing and transfer of cross-border controls as well. But I think the story is slightly different for domestic firms which are operating in a single market. But again, like to the point that you mentioned earlier, if these same domestic firms are looking outward, then there are different sort of like sovereign regulations from specific countries that will apply to them. And broadly, I think for firms, again, I think the third key takeaway point is to look at like how enforcement will play out, because while you do see some of these factoring into policy, but sometimes you are also likely to see enforcement going a little bit further, and therefore shaping some of how some of these policy debates will play out as well. The fact about the federal government and dynamics between the federal government and the state governments, as well as the government's response to how it views data as well, and how bureaucracy responds to some of these technical developments like AI and ML will also continue to factor in. But again, the key point to watch out for firms there is the enforcement angle and how that might not necessarily be very even.
That's an interesting point. And I think, I mean, maybe we can sort of, I have a couple of questions, so maybe we'll kind of work backwards from first that enforcement piece. So, how regulations are enforced, we've seen this in a very, very mixed bag in different places in the world, different places in the region. So if you and you touched on that, there's a federal and state structure in India with their own set of regulators and how that might work. I mean, if you're a company operating, what is sort of the strategy? What are the kinds of tools do you need to do to kind of manage a very localized regulator and maybe a national level regulator?
I mean, that will increasingly be the challenge. And in fact, there might be more regulatory requirements that will come into play. And given that a lot of the data ecosystem developments around the data ecosystem has happened only in the last 4 or 5 years, so you have like sectoral regulators who might require a certain of like compliance reporting. Then you have, say, hypothetically speaking, the data protection authority that might come in and require a certain level of reporting. And then you equally have like state level stakeholders as well. I mean, depending on what kind of firms you operate, what sectors you're based in, some of these can vary. And again, the data privacy bill wouldn't be standalone. It will feed off from and feed into a lot of interrelated legislations as well, both at the federal level and at the state level. I think for firms, the strategy at present is to accept the fact that there are likely to be a multitude of stakeholders. It wouldn't be a single authority that they might be reporting to, even if sometimes that is the indication that's given. So those kind of ground realities, I think, will need to be factored in for foreign businesses. Again, higher compliance requirements, depending on what industry they are in. If they are in critical infrastructure, if they are in like something that has a higher exposure of like B2C, business to consumer related data, they deal with higher levels of personal data. Again, those are elements that will need to be factored in as well.
Just to follow up on sort of the second thing about the second element in your future, and national champions. So I know that they've talked about this in India in the past around these large foreign international firms that are very technology-driven firms, but in many ways the people driving the technology are in India, right? And so I'm just wondering, what is your sense of, from a policy level, at a national level, what do you think that desire is to create national champions? And I mean, do you think that will be a policy goal to create national champions? And if it does happen, how do you think that will go?
The argument here stems more from point of an opportunity basis. So, I mean, you're looking at a data ecosystem that, and you do have like a young, vibrant population, and you do have like different business models that can actively be encouraged. I mean, let's also not forget this very vibrant, and some of the changes that are being driven in, say, for example, digital payments and equally across other education tech or fintech. Entities that handle a lot of data, also by young Indian entrepreneurs. So there's a very strong entrepreneurship argument that is playing out both at the state as well as at the federal level. And therefore, I think the domestic champion argument comes merely as a consequence, as a subset of those broader dynamics that are playing out as well. So I think actively, I don't think it's a question of, or it will be a question of foreign business versus domestic business. I think some of the answer will be more about like developing an integrated ecosystem. And of course, there are going to be like, it might not be a smooth road. There are going to be like pushes and pulls. And policies that may be convergent or contradictory. But eventually, I think the idea is to move towards an integrated framework and see how some of these like localized responses can build into.
Great. Maybe just the last question, just to wrap up this slide. We can talk a little bit about the framework, but thinking about critical infrastructure. So, in our work elsewhere in the region, indeed around the world, that's where we really see big growth in regulations and oversight. If you're familiar, there's a very famous case recently where a whole pipeline in the southeastern United States was shut down because of the potential of ransomware impacting that. So as you look upon that and given that it's a very, very broad concern, and I know that the strategy in India is still emerging. How do you think that sort of, if we accept that that's going to be like a national security priority, how do you think, how much of an impact do you think that's going to have, not on the more traditional side of it, but more on the newer aspects of it? So, I think in your earlier slide, you touched on Aadhaar and just that huge sort of personal data infrastructure that's being built out in India, eKYC stuff, and now also you mentioned digital payments. How do you think that that those kinds of systems may be subject to tighter regulation? Do you think that'll help?
It's interesting because even within the data privacy bill, that's currently being discussed, you do have provisions in terms of like specific cybersecurity. By specific, they are still broad, but specific in the sense of like how data needs to be dealt with, what kind of controls can be put in place, even if it's, again, as I mentioned, quite broad. So you do see some of the strands of that cybersecurity element working into the data privacy bill already. But I think in terms of like the applicability of, say, a cybersecurity strategy to looking at like the data privacy bill and related aspects, I think that bit is not very clear. So how might so I think broadly the answer would be like there might be, what we sense so far is that there might be differentiated responses. And because given that there are a multitude of stakeholders and there are specific sectoral regulators as well, it is likely to be more differentiated in terms of, both enforcement, but even in terms of like how things are implemented. So you might have the Security Exchanges Board of India looking at enforcing specific requirements for financial entities, but you have India's Reserve Bank, the Central Bank, Reserve Bank of India, looking at a different set of like requirements as well. Of course, there might be some overlaps, but again, the key to unpack some of these would be at the sectoral level, and would be to follow what kind of guidelines or rules and requirements they come up with.
Great. And so maybe that's a kind of a good opportunity for us to switch a little bit and talk about the analytical tools that we're using, right? So go to the next slide. What we've developed, and this is really based on sort of the past few years and our work around the sector, is we wanted to create a tool to help our clients understand and analyze these regulations. So the problem is that as you operate in different parts of the world, you have different requirements, and those different requirements on paper it may be the same, but in actual and functional reality can be very different country to country. So what we've done is we developed a framework that really takes a look and should be able to take most regulations, digital sovereignty regulations, and put it through this framework. And what the intent of the framework really to do is to help you break it down into composite pieces and understand how it can affect the business. What we've done is we have three broad themes. One is data privacy and protection. So we're really going to focus on that one today because that's substantively most of what the PDPB is about. The second area is around cybersecurity. And again, we'll see how that today is, not everything is addressed in that, but it's still relevant because without having that cybersecurity piece of it, the data protection pieces can't really be delivered. And the last element, the last theme that we want to look at is technology and operations, which is a bit of a grab bag, but it does think about, how regulators perform oversight of an organization. What are the disclosure requirements? And specifically, and this is something that is going to be relevant for our discussion, what are the geolocation requirements around data? Who can process that data? Where that data may be processed? So we've developed, for those three big themes, we developed a number of principles that we'll go into a little bit more detail today. Within those principles, there's 44 different elements, which is probably a little bit too narrowly focused for our conversation. So we'll talk about it more at a higher level. But when we think about this framework, it's fundamentally a tool to do three things. One is to develop a granular understanding of what the regulatory requirements are. The second is to identify how those regulations can impact a business. And lastly, to understand how these regulations or the impact compares to different sectors in different countries. We do that because we have clients in multiple different sectors operating in multiple different countries. And so having that comparative analysis for us has always been a very, very useful benchmarking tool to understand the relative impact of some of these regulations. So Hemant, maybe just go to the next slide. When I think what we can try to do is maybe, we'll kind of go back and forth and just, I'll introduce a point, you introduce a point, we can just discuss it. But what you see here is the entire framework filled out on a color scale of impact for all the different themes, right? That's data privacy, protection, cybersecurity, technology, and operations. And then what we've done is we've identified sectors which are interesting for the discussion point. So what we haven't done is done a deep analytical dive on these sectors, but we took a first pass view of looking at each one of these sectors and how the PDPB can affect it. So first we looked at traditional financial services, banking, insurance, but not in the sense of the new technology, but very much the old, in some cases still paper-driven technology. That's a critical infrastructure operator. The second one we looked at, telecommunications. Again, central to the operation of any kind of modern state, but also a critical infrastructure that's subject to significant regulation above and beyond just the regulations that must do around this data. Then we wanted to look at e-commerce. Again, especially in a place like India, where it's changing so quickly, we think it's very important to start to understand how different sectors in this new economy also may be affected. So we also looked at the entertainment OTT industry as well, to understand how that might have similar concerns. We did look at cloud service providers, but only a very, very narrow focus as infrastructure as a service providers, not the more broader B2C plays, but really that B2B process of providing compute storage functions to the business community. And then we also took a look at manufacturing. And the reason we chose manufacturing, and we thought about it in a very, very traditional way, is that business to business manufacturing, which as we look at it, you'll see it's actually quite obvious right there. The impact is much lower on that kind of organization than what you would see on critical infrastructure. And so the idea behind this is really we wanted to pull out differences and identify different functions. So when we think about this big holistic picture, there's a few points to talk about. And let me begin with one element of it, an aspect of it, and then I'll pass to you. But the first thing that I see when I think about it is, under that data privacy and protection piece is fairness, right? So that fairness section at the beginning is talking about consent, right? Having the appropriate consent, having the lawful basis to acquire the information and process the information. Data minimization, only have the minimal amount of information that you should hold. And also data storage, how long can you hold it, under what kind of conditions? If you look at those kinds of regulations across the top, you'll see that the impact is pretty consistent, regardless of its old economy, old critical infrastructure, new economy, or even some of the more traditional private sector. And that's simply because the law is designed to apply to everything. The law is designed to apply to everyone. And it's really important because when we look at this kind of regulation, it's consistent with what we see everywhere else around the region. And if not, in the world. GDPR, the European General Data Protection Regulation, is sort of the first one of the bigger personal data protection regulations. And those principles that it addressed are consistently addressed all around the world. And the PDPB is no different from that. And so when we talk about this to our clients, One of the things that we think is very, very important to understand is that no matter where you are, no matter what business you're in, this is going to change how you work and how you handle information. Now, the scale of that change you'll see it can be very, very different depending on what kind of business you run, what kind of data you process. But at a very, very basic level, it's important to remember that this is subject to all organizations. And so it's not something that you can kind of push back, push aside. It's something that you have to accept and adapt to. Hemant?
Yeah, Jim, I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think the additional point is in terms of what companies might want to watch out for. I mean, given that the impact is going to be quite wide ranging, I mean, despite whatever sector you're going to be in, would be to look at like what type of governance framework does the eventual PDPP Act actually espouse? I mean, it's not going to operate as a standalone law, and obviously it's going to feed from and feed into like different sets of laws. So what kind of broader governance mechanism does that entail? And I think it'll be a key question to watch out for, key development to look out for if you're like looking at then. If you're looking at laying down an information security framework in your organization and seeing how you can handle some of those like reporting requirements, and that is going to be a key issue as far as the fairness principle is concerned.
No, that's a really good point, because if you look down in the cybersecurity section, that's something that you highlighted earlier. There really isn't that a similar kind of regulation yet, but I think everyone understands is that you can't, to implement all these requirements around the personal information, it requires a level of data governance and data controls in place. So that to me is that's my first thought, is that there's a gap waiting to be filled there. Any ideas on that how that enforcement might work?
As far as the cybersecurity angle is concerned, again, if I were to pick like a couple of examples, and it's useful for companies to also understand either through the regulations or through the subsequent rules that when it comes into force, to look at like divisions between primary and secondary responsibilities. And you spoke about like cloud service providers, where they basically house data there. But the primary responsibility of generating the data falls with different set of stakeholders. So as far as enforcement is concerned, like who are authorities going to look at? If say, for example, there's a data breach, are they going to like hold the cloud service provider accountable, or is it going to be the primary the organization that's going to be held accountable? So those are still gray areas that will still need to be, even if it's not spelled out in the law or in the act, but as cybersecurity or like information governance professionals, those kind of issues need to be accommodated for as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if you look at the framework, you'll see all these yellow areas, right? These are places where there is no impact because it's not clear there's any regulation. And the first real big block is around compliance. That to me, that's not a block that's going to be empty for long, right? Because as the regulations mature and as they start to tie off some of these regulatory technology requirements and handling requirements, there must be a process where they test it and they review it and they hold people accountable for it. That's the part that when we look at this, that enforcement piece of it and how that's going to be enforced is something that it could be a concern, because you don't know really what you're going to be held accountable to and what you're going to have to do about it. So that can be a challenge for a lot of firms. And maybe just the last, the last bigger picture thing, we can start to move on to the next slide. But Hemant, I'm really kind of curious. We touched on this a little bit before, but there's a big block there towards the bottom that's all red. It's all around localization, and it's interesting. We've touched on this before, but maybe it'd be good to go back and just kind of remind us a little bit about national security and that as a driver for data localization.
Jim, the national security component is quite critical as far as the data localization argument is concerned, because you're talking about housing local data. And again, the reason for that can be manifold, but let's say pick an example of like law enforcement agencies needing certain access to data. but they wouldn't be able to access it from different jurisdictions. So that's partly driving this, but equally other dynamics that are also driving this is the opportunity argument in terms of like enabling a local ecosystem as well. So there are different elements that are feeding into the broader data localization dynamic. But it's interesting from the national security point of view, how it informs the cybersecurity debate, as well as how it informs the data privacy debate. These could be different. For example, the cybersecurity angle covers your critical infrastructure, whereas the data angle, the national security, as far as the data bits are concerned, covers a different sector itself, the new economies that you had pointed out as well. So I think that's also something to bear in mind. And the reason why I say this is because there is, or so far, there at least the last couple of decades, you've seen a lot of initiative by the private sector firms in terms of like cybersecurity regulations, in terms of like having some of those frameworks in place. But eventually, given some of these like overlapping issues and themes like national security playing out, I think it's important for even if you are like an information security manager or a cybersecurity specialist to look at some of how these broader trends then feed into specific action points that you might actually have to accommodate for into your framework as well.
Indeed, and I think one of the things I want to point out is that you'll see how when we get to those B2B businesses, it's not to say that the law doesn't apply to them. It's just that functionally it'll be easier for those organizations to manage it because it's smaller data sets. So maybe let's push on to the next slide. And I mean, Hemant, do you want to start us off? Any kind of observations you want to highlight here?
Yeah, I mean, quite a number of important observations. I mean, if you look at the blocks around financial services and telecommunications, which are obviously within that critical infrastructure piece, they do have a higher degree of exposure in terms of the threat environment. And therefore, as I pointed out, they firmly, again, come into that national security fabric. But interestingly, like if you're looking at sector like e-commerce, given the huge amount of data that is handled, it's B2C as well. Again, depending on how the personal versus the non-personal data framework and guidelines play out, even from a sectoral perspective. Again, those are areas where you're likely to see a lot more regulatory intervention and governance as well. And these could, again, extend to like a lot of B2C firms that do handle a huge amount of data. And you could contrast that with something like the manufacturing bits, where I think the exposure is relatively limited, but there might be other considerations, like, for example, the requirement for such firms for benchmarking against, say, their peers, or looking at the best practices from other industries. So it's going to be a lot of work in progress for firms even outside the traditional ambit of having a lot of like personal data or not having a lot of personal data to work with. And
and that's an interesting point. I just want to make really one that I think is important on this slide, at least that's interesting to me, is thinking about the national champions issue and those sort of new economy kinds of companies, e-commerce and entertainment OTT. Look, they have a large amounts of large volume of customers, so that's going to attract regulatory scrutiny, if you will, just because of the concerns and around national security, the concerns about making sure that the regulations are being followed, correctly. One thing that we've seen with our clients all around the region is that many multinational firms operate on this single shared services model, where there's one IT organization that provides services all the same all around the world. And one of the challenges to that model now are local regulations like this. Mm-hmm. And what we found is that, and I'll get to the point about the national champion piece in a moment, but what we found is that, it's not so much that the data localization part is hard. It costs money. No one really likes to do it. And in some ways, they feel that it limits their ability to derive further insight from that data. But the bigger challenge is more around the localization of the compliance function. And it's getting up the right sort of structure around that. And to me, it's an interesting question whether or not, for those kinds of, local domestic companies that are doing this, because they don't have a global compliance function. It's all being done. It's already been developed domestically. I don't know. Do you think that would present like a competitive advantage to them?
I mean, if you're looking at firms that strictly operate and look at India as like a domestic market, as a single market, for example, I think the regulatory requirements will be far lesser. And that's not to say the foreign companies will have higher regulatory requirements for a different set of reasons. And because they operate from a single market is why they'll have like a different graded requirements, if I may use the term loosely. But I think from the compliance angle, and as far as the broader debate about data localization and enforcement is also concerned, so a lot of this action is happening on the executive side of things, policymakers. What enforcement could possibly do is drive some of these into the judicial kind of like debates as well. So you're likely to have, a judicial review of maybe like rules or regulations or companies that might raise a specific issue and then have a judicial pronouncement on whether these are, are on compliance, but equally across the governance framework itself. That's also an additional dynamic that might play out, and the impact for sectors could then go up and down depending on how those elements also feed in. Yeah.
And look, I mean, and I think we've already touched on this, but it's maybe one of the last points on this slide is that, look, for some sectors, and we're talking about this context, B2B traditional manufacturing, the impact is not that high. Again, that's not to say they don't have to do things, but it's just that the volume of data is much lower. And, again, you think about that being a domestic industry, there isn't, the biggest pot of personal information they hold will be their employee data, which they wouldn't necessarily transfer overseas anyways. So again, I think it is a good way to think about it. And that's why we want to use the tool is to understand when we look at different sectors, what are the relative, areas of impact and how they can do that. Let's push on. Next slide. Let's talk about some of these buckets a little bit of a little more specifically. So, again, that aspect of different, sectors and different impacts. We really want to talk about critical infrastructure in the new economy. As I said, on traditional industry, the impact is minimal, although there's one point about it that I think might be interesting in the Indian context. But if we think about, critical infrastructure, I wanted to highlight this accountability section. And the accountability aspect is all the things like around, having a data privacy officer, or under the PDPB data fiduciary, which is sort of a function that's responsible for overall, execution of the program. Again, something that, is not uncommon. So Singapore requires it in some cases more than 500 records. China requires it for more than 1 million. So it's not an uncommon requirement. Obviously, GDPR requires it as well. What we found is that initially there's always a lot of resistance from our clients to this idea, because typically it means adding staff and adding overhead, adding extra work. And again, what we would encourage our clients to do is to really push beyond that, because it goes back to the idea that this is how things are going to be. These kinds of regulations are not going to go away. This is the trend the whole world is going in. And so having a function that's dedicated to managing this stuff correctly, managing this information, this personal data, which actually is not even the company's data, it's the individual's data, the data subject's information. It's going to be a core corporate function for the foreseeable future. And so the faster people and companies understand that and accept it and try to find the best people to execute it, the better off you're going to be, because the regulation is not going to go away. Hemant?
No, absolutely, Jim. And I think, it's also imperative for, businesses and firms to also look from outside and look more broadly at what's happening around as well, how some of the broader narratives will shape up eventually shape up or might have like an immediate impact on some of these localized regulatory developments as well. So it's much more imperative to look beyond just the Indian shows and see how some of those broader dynamics are also shaping up. So there's definitely looking from inside out, but equally an outside in perspective that's going to be quite critical in determining how the information governance and cybersecurity frameworks play out.
Yeah, and maybe just one last point to make about this slide. If we think about traditional industry, and one of the principles of the framework under data privacy protection is empowerment. And those are the means by which an individual can seek compensation, or can get restitution, or can make sure to hold the data processor accountable if something goes wrong. And that's something that's interesting because, look, India has a convoluted, a complex legal environment. And so if you think about this aspect of empowerment, it is something that we haven't really seen this manifest itself yet, but there have been cases where some of the provisions of the regulations can be used almost as a nuisance function. So if you think about it, every organization now is going to have to be able to update, delete, manage successfully people's personal data. These kinds of regulations can also open up organizations to liability that may come from an individual, may come from a whistleblower, an insider, an outsider, however it may be. And so that's why this aspect of understanding that kind of a risk and making sure that your processes are done the right way, we think it's very, very important. Because if you don't really anticipate how this could be used by someone against you, you're kind of leaving yourself open to what could be, again, given the complexities of the Indian legal system, just a very long, complex, judicial process to go through. I don't know, Hemant, do you have any thoughts on that?
In terms of enforcement, it's likely to be. As far as companies are concerned, they'll really have to look more broadly at how the picture shapes up, largely because there are going to be a multitude of stakeholders, and depending on what sector you're going to be in, there could be higher levels of enforcement, and it could be from a reporting perspective or a compliance perspective, or it could be from them requiring you to have like certain structures in place, but the companies not having. So some of these could be ad hoc, some of these could play out in a more streamlined manner. But again, the broader enforcement challenge is something that will continue to dot this specific landscape over the next few years. But it's also a cost function that firms will have to look for as well.
So maybe let's wrap up and go to the next slide. And really what we thought to close with is just just a few quick thoughts around looking at ASEAN and how that would compare to what could happen in India. Now in ASEAN, in many of the countries, they've already developed some of these cybersecurity regulations to go along with the existing data privacy regulations. So the picture is a little bit more nuanced. And this is ASEAN averages, 6 different countries. So what I would encourage you to do is don't think of this as the future, but just think of this as a possible alternative as the regulations mature and develop in India. So first and foremost, and I think this goes back to things that you've been talking about since the very beginning, look, we fully expect that cybersecurity regulations will become more defined, will become formally required, and there'll be compliance, compliance requirements that would go along with it. That's something that, fundamentally, you can't have some of these regulations without looking at cybersecurity. And also, again, we think about national security as a driver. That cybersecurity element of that becomes a critical concern. So the next thing is that we see that Southeast Asia is much more open on origin. So, there's less restrictions on the origin technology or the staff that's processing information or things like that. It's important to remember, and this is where India may be a little bit different, is that, Southeast Asia remains a consumer in many ways of technology. And so when you're a consumer of technology, you may not be able to be so picky about where it comes from. India may not have those kinds of constraints. And so seeing how that might affect that and how that could lead to national champions will be interesting. And lastly, we see, generally in Southeast Asia, there's a much lower impact on personal information. They have all those requirements, but they don't necessarily have all the same localization requirements around that. That's not to say that India would necessarily go down the same path, but it's an important thing to remember that other countries have looked at the same kind of national security concerns. They have similar requirements, but the one requirement they don't have is around localization. And so maybe the last thought to leave you with is that, if you ask yourself, is it really something that if you keep it localized, does that mean it's any safer? And I would argue probably not. And that's why some of those questions around cybersecurity, some of those questions around enforcement and compliance are so important. Hemant, any last closing thoughts?
I mean, Jim, in terms of like how things are going to play out in the digital landscape across India is concerned. So I think the final thought would be around like, there are going to be like multiple stakeholders. Companies will have to like look out for some of these like evolving regulations. But I just broadly concur with what you just said. I think that resonates with me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll see what the enforcement looks like as well. That's going to be a key element. So with that, Thank you all very much for your time. I hope you found it interesting. Please don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. And thanks very much to Grey Hat Media for the invitation.
And to borrow a term from the world of cinema, that's a wrap. We have come to the end of this edition of the Enterprise Innovation Summit 2021, our biggest one yet. Now, over the last 3 days, we've looked at infrastructure innovation, experience innovation, and security innovation as we tread into a decade that is likely to be very, very different from the ones we've had in the past. And helping us put together over 15 hours of innovation talks and over 30 speakers from across the world were our presenting partners Yota and our gold partners Commvault, HP Enterprise Unique Solutions, Infoblox, Tata Communications, Veeam, Versec, the Uptime Institute, and Zoom. You could head to their virtual stalls anytime to discover their innovations, which can help you plan your enterprise's tech roadmap. So, as a wrap up, let me first thank you for giving us the opportunity to present innovations that has engaged you with us for the last 3 days. I want to thank our partners for supporting us in this event, our speakers for taking time out and sharing with us their thoughts, the Grey Hat team and the production crew for making sure that this was an excellent event. So till the next Enterprise Innovation Summit, this is me signing off. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.